But we begin with our big story. The International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel must stop its military offensive immediately in the city of Rafah in southern Gaza. The United Nations top court did stop short of ordering a ceasefire in the territory. Nearly 1 million people have evacuated Rafah in recent weeks as Israel's military expands its operation in the city's center, driving more civilians out with nowhere to go. This is all happening despite growing international outrage over the humanitarian crisis on the ground there. And days after the International Criminal Court announced that it was seeking arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with Hamas officials over crimes against humanity in the war in Gaza. Meantime, Israel is condemning Norway, Ireland, and Spain after the three European countries said they would recognize a Palestinian state. Joining me now is ABC News national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy. Mick, great to be with you on a Friday night. Want to get your initial reaction to this ruling from the UN's top court. Essentially, how is Israel going to respond to this? What does it do as far as the military operation in Gaza goes, in Rafah?
So, Elizabeth, it's important to point out the ICJ, as you said, is the UN official court. The ICC, although it started in the UN, is separate and it's a member organized court. But together, this is putting a lot of, I think, pressure that already exists on the Israeli government, obviously from the international community, but also from their own population on how they're going to end this conflict in Gaza, specifically when it comes to Rafah. There's obviously the hostage issue that's at play, but also this continuing humanitarian crisis of what you just mentioned. So this is binding, but there is no way to enforce it. So it does create significant more pressure that Israel is just going to have to deal with. And of course, the United States is too, as its most significant strategic partner.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about this mounting international criticism of Israel. I mean, key U.S. allies, Mick, are taking and breaking with the U.S., taking a different position. What do you make of that, and how much pressure does that put on the U.S.-Israel relationship?
I think it puts a lot. I mean, we've seen the United States still is with Israel, of course, when it comes to the military defeat of Hamas, their overall objective. But there's been growing, I think, disagreement on how the war has been prosecuted. It started private, it ended up public, and now it's very public. And a lot, as you said, of our allies are actually calling for an end to hostilities and stopping the offensive into Rafah, which the United States is now very clearly against. Mostly because this is causing a significant humanitarian crisis to only get worse. There's about 1 million people that are being displaced again. They're moving to places where there's really not sufficient food, water, medicine, and shelter. This is going to keep building. And I think ultimately it's going to be something that the United States has to deal with, not just with Israel, but with the rest of the international community, which is obviously very much against what's going to happen in Rafah if this goes as a full-scale military operation.
Well, and when we think about the ceasefire negotiations and the fact that, Israel is still going forward right now with the Operation Rafah, we do know today that Israel recovered bodies of 3 of the hostages. How do you think that affects the prospect for negotiations, if at all?
So there's 2 things on this front that may actually push this toward an actual negotiated agreement. One is that they're doing this offensive in Rafah, right? So this puts a lot of pressure on Hamas leadership. They don't want this to end. They have 4 battalions still intact there. They obviously want to maintain their freedom. So that gives them pressure. But also the release of this video of the hostages, which I'm sure was a horrible decision made by the families, but the purpose was to put pressure on the Israeli government, I believe, and I think it has. So there's pressure on both sides now, which is why I think Director Burns has flown to Paris to see if this can't be reinitiated and hopefully end with a ceasefire, what would solve or at least answer a lot of the questions that we've talked about already.
And so many of those families have gotten their hopes up, and then they have been dashed over the past several months. Mick, please stick around with us because I want to bring the big story to the rest of our panel. Also joining us today is Democratic strategist and former special assistant to the president and director of message planning, Megan Hayes, ABC News contributor and former Republican from New York, Congressman John Katko, and ABC News contributor and SiriusXM radio host Mike Muse. Thank you all for being here on this Friday night. John, I want to pick up a little bit on the conversation Mick and I were having about the international outrage, but also the fact that we saw this week a bipartisan group of senators bring legislation to basically condemn what the International Criminal Court said after they were looking for those arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu. We've seen Republicans especially say they want to sanction the ICC. Is there this break happening between lawmakers on Capitol Hill and the UN and some of these key international organizations?
Yeah, I think there is, and here's my concern. My concern is that you have Hamas, who went in on October 7th and committed unspeakable atrocities, engage in those after the fact, as we saw from the videos, and then they put all their people at risk, which they knew they were going to do when they committed these atrocities, and they knew that that Israel was going to come in and do what they did. And then you have the court condemn Israel for fighting back. Now, Israel, you can argue with what they did and how they did it, but my concern is that you're going to embolden other similarly situated groups to Hamas around the world to do similar conduct, and then allow their people to be slaughtered or killed in a conflict, and then go to the UN and seek sympathy. So that, to me, is a very dangerous precedent they're setting, and I think that's what the people in the Senate are concerned with, and that's what the American people are concerned with that are in a leadership position. Listen, it's hard to watch what Israel's doing, but there's a lot at stake here as far as empowering bad elements. So that's my concern.
At the same time, Megan, we are seeing several key U.S. allies start to be more forceful in their condemnation of Israel. We saw several countries in Europe this week recognize a Palestinian state. How do you see this putting pressure on the White House and President Biden?
I think that the president's been very clear here that there's one mission. It's to get the hostages back. It's to get a ceasefire and to work towards a two-state solution and to have peace. And so I think that these things that the international community are doing, I understand why they're doing it, but I just feel like it's isolating Israel more. It's just like what your other guest was saying, that this is just creating more opportunity for other people to come in. It's just not we're just not setting up a good situation here. We need to really focus on getting the hostages back for Israel and to getting aid to Gaza and working towards a permanent ceasefire and actual having peace and a two-state solution here. But like this other extraneous noise is just that. It's just noise at this point.
Well, and Mike Muse, pick up on that. I mean, what do you make of this reality that Israel does appear to be growing more isolated on the world stage?
They are, and it's all indications by what we've been seeing coming out this week when it comes to that. In particular, as more of the Western countries are beginning to condemn the actions of Israel, you actually see Israel becoming more entrenched in their trajectory that they have going forward. I was actually listening to a statement earlier from the National Security Minister, to which he said, and I quote, he wants to see the utter shattering of Hamas until achievement of total victory. Well, Elizabeth, what exactly does that mean, right? And that was part of some members of Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet asking for now less than 2 weeks to have a plan to figure out what happens on the day going forward. And so people have an understanding that Israel has a right to defend itself, but now the question is being asked at what cost and what does the strategy look like? What does total victory mean without it being defined? And even the court issued opinions that did talk about they have a right to defend, but not the right to go on the offense. And then the court did today say that they have a right to, they want to see all the hostages returned immediately. So we're getting more nuance with the Western countries' opposition to Israel, while at the same time asking for Israel for what is the plan for the morning after.
Well, and as we think about some of the costs of the humanitarian crisis, Mick, we did see President Biden today say that Egypt will reopen a critical crossing to resume delivery of aid into Rafah. What do you make of that announcement? Do you think that will help increase the flow of that much-needed aid there?
Yes, Elizabeth, it will, and it needs to happen. Right now, in some cases, only about 25 trucks are getting in from the ground. There's about 7 ground entry points into Gaza. If you look at before the war, there was around 500 a day, and that was only when 67% of the population needed it. Now 100% of the population needed it. So we have this maritime corridor, which the U.S. has led, that is bringing aid, and that's only going to increase, and that is getting to a population in Gaza that can't get it from the southern entry points. So this needs to be Kerem Shalom, Rafah, and the maritime corridor just to get back to where we were before the war started.
Just to get back there, and still much to go ahead. Megan, John, Mike, and Mick, thank you all very much.